Have you ever experienced an inexplicable shiver while interacting with someone, as if something unseen yet profoundly unsettling was unfolding beneath their friendly exterior? Carl Jung, a luminary in the field of psychology, identified a disturbing pattern throughout his extensive clinical practice. He discovered a silent cue that signals a danger far more significant than any explicit physical threat. This indicator, often overlooked by our conscious awareness, but sensed by our most primal instincts, doesn't manifest through aggressive language or overtly harmful actions. Instead, it operates on a more subtle level, and precisely because of this subtlety, it is infinitely more perilous. Ancient wisdom traditions have long cautioned about such individuals, but Jung scientifically articulated what our ancestors intuitively understood. The most unsettling aspect of this signal is that it can appear in individuals who seem entirely normal, even charismatic. Upon detecting it, the only prudent response is immediate withdrawal. Shadow projection stands out as perhaps the most hazardous psychological mechanism that Jung discerned in human relationships. Picture this. You're engaged in conversation with someone who suddenly attributes to you intentions, thoughts, or negative traits that you have never expressed or demonstrated. This individual isn't responding to the real you, but to a distorted image they've constructed in their mind. Does this scenario resonate with you? What you're experiencing at that moment is the projection of the Jungian shadow in its purest form. The shadow encapsulates everything we disown about ourselves, the aspects we deem unacceptable, and thus relegate to the unconscious. However, these elements don't simply vanish. They persist outside our conscious awareness, accumulating energy within the depths of our psyche. When an individual consistently projects their shadow onto others, they are displaying the most dangerous signal that Jung identified: the complete inability to acknowledge their own denied aspects. This person literally cannot perceive these traits within themselves, consequently perceiving them exclusively in others. The danger lies in the fact that, from their perspective, you genuinely embody those negative characteristics. Ancient spiritual traditions recognized this phenomenon long before Jung provided its academic articulation. In Buddhism, there's the concept of the darkened mirror reflecting one's own impurities as if they were foreign. Within the Christian tradition, we find the metaphor of noticing the beam in one's own eye while pointing out the speck in another's. What's truly alarming is that the person projecting their shadow is utterly convinced of the validity of their perceptions. It's not a conscious deception. They genuinely see in you what they deny in themselves. This perceptual distortion generates a particular kind of conviction that is exceptionally persuasive to onlookers. The projecting individual can convince others that you are exactly as they describe you. Contemporary neuroscience has corroborated Jung's postulates, revealing that our brains actively filter reality to confirm our pre-existing beliefs. However, in cases of significant shadow projection, this filter becomes a complete distortion of reality. Researcher Robert Johnson likened this phenomenon to wearing glasses that alter everything we perceive. But how do you recognize when you are encountering someone who is massively projecting their shadow? The revealing signal emerges when you sense a gap between what this individual articulates about you and your own internal reality. They might accuse you of intentions you've never harbored or ascribe to you emotions you haven't felt. Most disturbingly, they present these accusations with unwavering certainty, impervious to any contradictory evidence. What is truly occurring when you experience this is that you are encountering the external manifestation of an internal conflict. This person is desperately battling against aspects of themselves they cannot accept, and you have involuntarily become the arena for this struggle. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, goes the ancient proverb, but Jung might add, and driven by those who consider themselves unquestionably good. Ego inflation poses an extraordinary danger precisely because it often masquerades as virtue. When you observe someone completely persuaded of their moral high ground, their spiritual faultlessness, or their grasp of an absolute truth, you are observing what Jung termed psychic inflation, arguably the most concerning indicator of all. Unlike mere arrogance, which is readily discernible, Jungian inflation represents a far more profound and perilous phenomenon. It arises when an individual's ego merges. Okay, here is the text divided into paragraphs as requested. The revealing signal emerges when you sense a gap between what this individual articulates about you and your own internal reality. They might accuse you of intentions you've never harbored or ascribe to you emotions you haven't felt. Most disturbingly, they present these accusations with unwavering certainty, impervious to any contradictory evidence. What is truly occurring when you experience this is that you are encountering the external manifestation of an internal conflict. This person is desperately battling against aspects of themselves they cannot accept, and you have involuntarily become the arena for the struggle. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, goes the ancient proverb, but Jung might add, and driven by those who consider themselves unquestionably good. Ego inflation poses an extraordinary danger precisely because it often masquerades as virtue. When you observe someone completely persuaded of their moral high ground, their spiritual faultlessness, or their grasp of an absolute truth, you are observing what Jung termed psychic inflation, arguably the most concerning indicator of all. Unlike mere arrogance, which is readily discernible, Jungian inflation represents a far more profound and perilous phenomenon. It arises when an individual's ego merges with archetypal contents, especially with the image of the Savior, the Enlightened One, or the bearer of truth. This individual no longer perceives themselves as a limited human being, but as a direct representative of the divine or the absolute. The German mystic Meister Eckhart cautioned centuries ago about this phenomenon, describing it as the most subtle trap on the spiritual path. Zen traditions refer to it as Zen sickness, while Sufis speak of the veil of light, more dangerous than the veil of darkness because it is far more challenging to recognize as an obstacle. The unmistakable sign appears when you notice that this person never doubts their own motivations. While all the great sages in history have expressed profound humility before the mysteries of existence, those afflicted with psychic inflation exhibit absolute certainty. They do not entertain the possibility of error because in their mind, they are not expressing personal opinions but universal truths. What is particularly dangerous about this state is that it can generate extraordinary charisma. Jung observed how leaders with severe psychic inflation attracted devoted followers precisely because of the absolute conviction they radiated. This certainty satisfies our deep human need for security and definitive answers in a world of uncertainties. The Chilean psychologist Claudio Naranjo, a student of spiritual traditions, pointed out that the spiritual ego is the most refined and difficult to detect. An ordinary ego proclaims, "I am important." An inflated ego proclaims, "I am a channel of the supreme good." This subtle difference explains why so many people are drawn to potentially dangerous individuals who nevertheless appear to be spiritually elevated. How to recognize psychic inflation in someone. Observe their reaction to criticism or disagreement. The person with ego archetypal inflation does not process questioning as useful information, but as an affront to the cosmic order itself. They interpret any opposition not as a legitimate human disagreement, but as resistance to the good, the truth, or the divine that they represent. Jung warned that this state poses a danger not only to others, but primarily to the one who experiences it. The identification of the small ego with transpersonal contents subjects the psyche to unbearable tension that eventually demands compensation. The greater the inflation, the more dramatic the collapse when the denied aspects finally emerge. What could be more unsettling than someone who shows you exactly what you expect to see at all times and circumstances? Jung discovered a disturbing pattern in certain individuals, a social adaptation so perfect that it eliminates any roughness, contradiction, or human spontaneity. This impeccable mask or persona, a term Jung borrowed from the Greek theater, represents a warning sign that our instincts detect long before our conscious mind can articulate it. Total identification with the persona constitutes an extraordinary psychological danger because it indicates a complete dissociation between the external image and the inner being. The individual has sacrificed their authenticity on the altar of social acceptance, creating a facade so elaborate that they themselves have forgotten what exists behind it. As the poet Fernando Pessoa expressed, the danger is not in the mask, but in forgetting that it is a mask. Eastern contemplative traditions have pointed out this phenomenon for millennia. In Zen Buddhism, there is talk of the original face before birth, that essential authenticity that exists beyond our social constructions. Taoist masters warned about the danger of polishing the surface so much that the substance wears away. Jung simply translated these ancient observations into the language of modern psychology. The warning sign arises when you perceive a strange sense of artificiality in interactions with someone, even though their behavior is technically impeccable. This person always knows what to say, how to act, what facial expressions to adopt. But all of this lacks the unpredictability and inconsistencies inherent in authentic humanity. As the Jungian analyst James Hollis pointed out, excessive perfection in social adaptation often indicates a proportional emptiness in inner life. Contemporary neuroscience has identified a fascinating phenomenon related to this dynamic. Our brains are equipped with mirror neurons that detect subtle incongruities between the verbal, facial, and bodily expressions of others. When someone's social mask is completely divorced from their inner reality, these neurons generate a warning signal that we experience as an inexplicable feeling of unease or distrust. The real danger lies in what this extreme dissociation hides. When someone has invested all their psychic energy in maintaining a perfect external image, the rejected aspects of the personality do not simply disappear. They accumulate in the unconscious, forming what Jung called the shadow. And the more rigid the persona, the more chaotic and potentially destructive their shadow will be when it inevitably emerges. Marie-Louise von Franz, a close collaborator of Jung, observed that those who present a perfect social adaptation often experience episodes of shadow eruption, moments where all the repressed energy explodes in unpredictable and potentially destructive ways. This dynamic explains why frequently the apparently most perfect people are capable of surprisingly destructive acts. Complete identification with the social persona represents, in Jung's words, a betrayal of the self, an abandonment of authentic individuality in favor of an artificial construction. And like all deep betrayals, it eventually takes its psychological toll. Imagine you are conversing with someone, and suddenly you perceive a subtle but profound change. The same person physically, but something fundamental has shifted in their gaze, in their energy, in the quality of their presence, as if something ancient and transpersonal were manifesting through them. This unsettling experience, which many traditional cultures recognize as a form of possession, was conceptualized by Jung as archetypal possession, perhaps the most alarming sign we can detect in another human being. Archetypes, according to Jung, are primordial patterns of the human collective psyche, structuring forces of our experience that contain both luminous and shadowy aspects. When an archetype possesses a person's consciousness, they lose their individuality and become a channel for transpersonal energies that far exceed their capacity for integration. Shamanic traditions of various cultures perfectly understood this phenomenon. Anthropologist Mircea Eliade extensively documented how these cultures developed sophisticated methods for managing these energies, distinguishing between beneficial channeling and dangerous possession. From a Jungian perspective, archetypal possession implies a loss of normal psychological flexibility. Becoming rigidly identified with a single archetypal pattern, it may be the unquestionable savior, the relentless warrior, the perpetual victim, the infallible judge. The specific archetype matters less than the complete identification with it. Revealing indicators include a strange glow in the eyes, a monolithic quality in speech, and a peculiar feeling that the person is no longer completely present in the ordinary sense. As Jungian analyst Robert Moore pointed out, you are not relating to a complete human personality, but to an archetypal fragment that has usurped control of consciousness. Modern neuropsychology has identified altered states of consciousness where certain brain areas associated with personal identity show reduced activity, while areas linked to transpersonal experiences are intensely activated. These states, valuable in controlled ritual contexts, can be extremely dangerous when they occur spontaneously without the appropriate container. What is particularly alarming is that the person possessed by an archetype experiences an extraordinary sense of certainty and purpose. The ambiguity of ordinary consciousness disappears, replaced by an absolute conviction that can be extremely persuasive to others. Jung observed how political and religious leaders in states of archetypal possession could catalyze mass movements precisely because of this quality of superhuman certainty. The fundamental danger lies in the fact that archetypes, as primordial patterns of the collective unconscious, contain extreme polarities. The same archetype of the Savior contains both the potential for redemptive compassion and destructive fanaticism. When a person becomes completely identified with an archetype, they will inevitably manifest its darkest aspects, often without any awareness of the contradiction. Jung documented numerous cases where individuals possessed by archetypes committed acts completely contrary to their conscious values, later experiencing partial amnesia or extreme rationalization. Archetypal possession represents the temporary loss of the capacity for self-reflection, precisely what makes us human. There is a psychological phenomenon so disturbing that when you recognize it in someone, you understand that you are witnessing a genuine tragedy in development. Jung called it compulsion to repeat, an unconscious pattern where the person obsessively recreates the same painful situations, as if trapped in an invisible labyrinth from which they cannot escape. This signal, when we clearly detect it in another, warns us that we are facing an extraordinary danger, being involved in a psychological drama that does not belong to us. What is truly alarming about the compulsion to repeat is its automatic and unconscious quality. The person is not consciously or maliciously choosing to recreate destructive patterns. They are responding to deep psychic forces that operate completely outside their consciousness. As psychoanalyst Christopher Bollas expressed, they are unthought knowns, formative experiences so early or traumatic that they were never cognitively processed, but organize all subsequent experience. Spiritual traditions have recognized this phenomenon for millennia. The Buddhist concept of karma originally did not refer to a cosmic system of reward and punishment, but precisely to these patterns of conditioning that lead us to recreate similar circumstances over and over again. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the idea of original sin can be interpreted psychologically as these unconscious patterns that we inherit and perpetuate without conscious choice. The revealing sign appears when you observe someone who consistently ends up in the same painful situations with different people, but following an amazingly similar script. Even more disturbing, the person seems sincerely surprised each time the pattern is repeated, as if they were a victim of destiny instead of the unconscious architect of their own recurring experience. Contemporary neuroscience has discovered a biological basis for this phenomenon. Early experiences, especially traumatic ones, literally create neural pathways that become routes of least resistance for information processing. The brain develops a neurological expectation that unconsciously seeks to confirm its pre-existing models of the world, even when these models produce suffering. The most dangerous aspect is that people trapped in unconscious repetition, compulsions unconsciously try to recruit others to play roles in their unresolved internal drama. As psychoanalyst Donald Kalschit pointed out, unprocessed trauma demands to be staged. Without realizing it, we can find ourselves playing a role in a story that began long before we met this person. Jung observed a fascinating phenomenon. The more unconscious the compulsion to repeat, the more it seems to manifest as synchronicities or significant coincidences in external life. The person unconsciously creates situations that replicate their unresolved internal dynamics, but experiences these events as if they were imposed by a cruel or unjust external fate. Jungian therapists identify this signal when they hear someone repeatedly narrate stories where they are always betrayed, abandoned, misunderstood, or victimized in surprisingly similar ways. As Marie-Louise von Franz expressed, Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. What is most disturbing is that the compulsion to repeat has an almost magnetic quality. The person trapped in these patterns unconsciously emits signals that attract precisely those who can help them recreate their original traumatic scenarios. Jung called this phenomenon negative synchronicity, the extraordinary ability of the unconscious to orchestrate encounters that perpetuate its unresolved patterns. If the signals we have explored reveal the deepest dangers, according to Jung, there is a transformative path that transcends these threats, the conscious integration of the shadow. This process represents the fundamental difference between psychologically dangerous people and those who have embarked on the journey towards psychic wholeness. The fascinating thing is that we can recognize this integration as clearly as we identify its absence. And when we perceive it in someone, we are facing the antithesis of psychological danger. Shadow integration does not mean moral perfection or absence of negative aspects. On the contrary, it implies a humble and conscious recognition of one's own capacity for all the errors and darkness we observe in others. As Jung expressed, "I would rather be whole than good," a frequently misunderstood phrase that really points to the difference between authentic psychological integrity and a mask of perfection that hides dangerous internal divisions. Contemplative traditions have articulated this process for millennia with different languages. Tibetan Buddhism speaks of transforming poison into medicine, recognizing and constructively using even the most difficult emotions and tendencies. Western alchemy, which fascinated Jung so much, symbolically represented this process as the transmutation of lead, rejected aspects, into gold, integrated consciousness. The indicators of a person who has genuinely begun this process of integration are unmistakable. A peculiar combination of honesty about their own shadows and compassion towards the shadows of others. This person can admit their own problematic impulses and tendencies without excessive shame or self-indulgence, simply as aspects of the human condition that require constant awareness. Contemporary neuroscience has confirmed that this integration process has observable neurophysiological correlates. Researchers like Daniel Siegel have documented how the integration of previously dissociated aspects of experience literally creates new neural connections between different brain regions, particularly between primitive emotional centers and prefrontal areas associated with self-reflection. What is truly transformative about this process is that, paradoxically, consciously recognizing our most difficult aspects dramatically decreases the likelihood of unconsciously acting them out. As Jungian analyst Robert Johnson observed, what we deny does not disappear. It simply emerges in forms over which we have less control. Conscious integration transforms potentially destructive psychic energy into available creative force. The person who has genuinely initiated this inner work exhibits a unique quality: the ability to see the world in shades of gray instead of absolute black and white. They do not rigidly divide between good and bad, recognizing universal human complexity. As Jungian psychologist James Hollis pointed out, psychological maturity begins when we abandon the fantasy of our absolute innocence. Authentic spiritual teachers throughout history have embodied this integration. The Dalai Lama can speak openly about his moments of anger. Teresa of Avila recognized her periods of spiritual aridity. The Sufi mystic Rumi wrote poetically about his internal contradictions. This radical honesty contrasts dramatically with the artificial perfection of those who are dissociated from their shadows. The most reliable indicator of integration in process is a peculiar combination of genuine humility, not false modesty, and authentic authority, not authoritarianism. The integrated person does not need to proclaim their goodness or wisdom because they have transcended the need for an immaculate self-image. As Zen master Shunryu Suzuki expressed, "In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's there are few." Before we say goodbye, have you recognized any of these signals in important people in your life? Or more importantly, have you detected aspects of these patterns in yourself? If this message touched your heart, write in the comments. Consciousness is the first step towards transformation. Don't forget to share this content with those who need to awaken to the unconscious patterns in their relationships. Activate the bell and subscribe for more explorations of the fascinating Jungian universe.